Thanks. So thank you for zooming in. Today's talk on U.S. climate change policy is with Roger Karapin. My name is John Withey, and I'm faculty in Evergreen's Master of Environmental Studies program, or MES program. I'm also the current acting director of MES, and I use he, him pronouns. I will introduce our speaker in a few minutes, but I wanted to start by thanking Professors Rachel Hastings and Zoltan Grossman and Sarah Williams for inviting us and Roger to contribute to the climate change talks and seminars and events that have been happening all year. And I thought I'd mention that the last speaker in the climate justice and resilience series specifically is next week, Evergreen Emeritus Professor Jeff Antonellis-Lapp, who's scheduled for next Wednesday, May 26th at 11:30 a.m. With a virtual field trip in the Nisqually River watershed. And we can link to that series page in the chat in a minute. Since we're all here because we're presumably interested in climate change policies and climate justice and climate resilience and climate action, it's particularly important to acknowledge the opportunity that we have to learn about these topics from indigenous peoples, both here in the Pacific Northwest and around the world. And I'm going to paraphrase the words of Alejandro Fried, who's an ecologist that works with the First Nations of British Columbia, who wrote that despite the ravages of colonialism and the ongoing inequities, racism, and violence directed at their peoples, indigenous cultures have over thousands of years developed complex practices for resource management that epitomize sustainability and resilience. And so with that in mind, I'll acknowledge that the Evergreen State College sits on the traditional lands of the Medicine Creek Treaty tribes, which include Squaxin Island, the Nisqually Indian tribe, and the Puyallup tribe of Indians. And the 1854 treaty ceding these lands is still in dispute. I myself am physically right now in the homeland of the Duwamish tribe of Indians, which is the first tribe named in the 1855 Point Elliott Treaty. And so with this awareness, I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present of all of the Medicine Creek Treaty and Point Elliott Treaty tribes, and invite all of us to be grateful to learn on their lands, especially with regard to climate resilience. So to introduce today's speaker, Roger Karapin is Professor of Political Science at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. His research areas include climate policy, energy policy, environmental policy, and environmental politics in both Western Europe and the US. And his 2016 book, published by Cambridge University Press, is titled Political Opportunities for Climate Policy, California, New York, and the Federal Government. And so we at Evergreen and the MES program have invited Professor Karapin to talk today about U.S. climate change policies in the Biden administration. And thank you very much for coming today, Roger.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. And thank you all for the invitation to speak here today. And thanks to everybody in the audience for coming to this online meeting. I really liked your introduction concerning the location of where your college is. I should let you know I'm speaking to you from Montclair, New Jersey, which is used to be land that was occupied by the Lenape Indians here. My talk today is about climate change policy in the Biden administration, with some background from the Obama and Trump administrations. In 2016, I wrote a book about US climate policy that went through the end of the Obama administration. And then I had to wait 4 years to be able to give a talk about further progress in climate policy. So I'm glad I didn't have to wait 8 years. So my focus is on climate change mitigation policies. That means any policy that reduces net greenhouse gas emissions, for example, by developing wind or solar power, or promoting electric vehicles, or requiring methane reductions in industry. Like you, most interested in what the Biden administration is doing in this area, but first some context is necessary in order to understand where we are, how we got here, and where we're likely to go. So first of all, it's now widely recognized in the United States that anthropogenic climate change is a serious public problem. This slide shows sorry, got distracted by my monitor there. This slide shows newspaper coverage from 5 print newspapers from 2000 to 2021. And you can see really that there's been an increase in attention beginning around 2007, with some ups and downs since then, but really with pretty sustained large peaks in 2015, 17, 2019, 2021. Basically, we've had a sustained high level of attention on the issue in 2015, since 2015, compared to what we had before around 2007. And that's true whether or not you include the New York Times, which tends to have more coverage here than the other newspapers do. So that's one indicator of attention on the issue. Another one comes from public opinion. And this is Gallup data that goes all the way back to 2001. And if you look at the first and second lines, you can see that about 60% of the public now sees global warming as human caused and is having effects that have already started. So at the same time, and this is perhaps puzzling, the United States has had relatively weak national level climate policy on the whole compared to West European countries. The US has no legally binding targets, no carbon pricing through emissions trading or carbon tax, no national renewable portfolio standard. The Kyoto Protocol was signed by the United States under the Clinton administration, but not ratified by the Senate in the late 1990s. State level governments, especially in Democratic Party governed states, have compensated to some extent, largely through renewable energy and energy efficiency policies, and also some carbon pricing in the Northeast and in California. These efforts are very important, but they're not sufficient to reduce greenhouse gases across the entire country, enough for the US to contribute to limiting global warming to 2 degrees. So why is federal climate policy relatively weak? Well, scholars have a basic consensus on the main reasons. One is that we have strong fossil fuel industries in the United States, and they have political clout in Washington. A second reason is that there's a climate science denial movement, largely funded by the fossil fuel industry, that's become influential over a large segment of elite and public opinion. We also have institutional reasons. We have a fragmented system of government with many veto points. It's easy for one party to block anything, including climate policy, if it has a majority in either the House or the Senate, the Electoral College, or on the federal courts. Another reason is more recent. It's rising party polarization. Republicans have shifted towards strong opposition to climate change policy in the last couple of decades. And during the same time period, we've had an increasing tendency in our political system for the national institutions to be divided between the parties rather than for them to be under the unified control of one of the parties. So these are structural factors. That means they change only very slowly, if at all, yet they sometimes have been overcome when committed political actors take advantage of a window of opportunity. So the Obama administration did so and produced some major changes in federal climate policy. Immediately after he took office, the Obama administration and the Democrats in Congress put forward a stimulus bill that included $85 billion in clean energy and energy efficiency spending. Then they tried the Waxman-Markey bill for emissions trading and a national renewable portfolio standard. And that failed. And after it failed, actually really around the same time that it was failing, the Obama administration adopted a relatively ambitious regulatory approach to greenhouse gas emissions on the basis of the Supreme Court's decision in the Massachusetts versus EPA decision of 2007 and the Environmental Protection Agency's endangerment finding in 2009. So they set ambitious new rules in 3 main areas. The first was motor vehicles. the Obama administration nationalized California's policy for cars and light trucks. Through deals with car makers, they required about a 50% cut in emissions per mile over the 2011 to 2025 period for over 14 years. The slide you're looking at right now shows that car standards this is for miles per gallon, which is pretty much the same thing as emissions per mile, just inverted. These standards were flat from 1985 to 2010. And then, because of the new policy by the EPA, they rose sharply. So these deals that the Obama administration made with car makers also preserve California's right to adopt standards that are stricter than the federal government. And that's important because other states are allowed to follow California's standards if they want to. So it doesn't affect just California. So motor vehicle is one area of direct regulation. Power plants is a second area. The administration adopted rules on new power plants in 2013, effectively making it impossible to build a new coal-fired plant unless it included carbon capture and storage technology, which is not commercially feasible. They also adopted rules for existing power plants, which is a much larger share of power generation, of course, through the Clean Power Plan in 2015. It was supposed to be implemented by state governments starting in 2022, but it was blocked by the Supreme Court early in 2016 and never went into effect. The third area of direct greenhouse gas regulation is methane. Rules were issued for the oil and gas industry in 2016. The industry is supposed to find and repair leaks and limit flaring. And rules for the municipal solid waste landfills requiring a 1/3 reduction were also adopted that year. The other domestic policy the Obama administration adopted was energy efficiency, 45 new standards for appliances and equipment. They were working off a backlog from the Bush administration, where the Bush administration hadn't adopted standards keeping pace with technological change. They were behind in terms of the legal requirements. So Obama had a lot of work to do in terms of standards for appliances and equipment. On the international stage, Obama reasserted U.S. leadership, which had lapsed under George W. Bush. He put forward a target of a 17% reduction in greenhouse gases from 2005 to 2020 in the Copenhagen Accords. That was in 2009. And then a more ambitious target, or a farther reaching target, of 26 to 28% reduction by the year 2025 in the Paris Agreement. That was adopted in 2015. So on this slide, you can see those targets in relation to the previous trajectory of US greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, we had greenhouse gas emissions at around 6,500 megatons per year, and that had risen to a peak of around 2007. And the Copenhagen target is the red dotted line here, and the Paris target is the green dotted line here. So this was calling for some cuts, relatively ambitious, but achievable. So what can we learn from the Obama administration? I think there are 5 lessons. The first is that in the current political environment, many elected officials, mostly Democrats, will make climate policy a priority. But the second lesson is that with highly polarized political parties and often divided government and the filibuster rules in the Senate, Congress is unlikely to pass major climate legislation. The third lesson, though, is that there is, however, an exception. In an economic crisis, it's possible to include clean energy spending and stimulus bills that Congress may pass. Fourth lesson is that the Clean Air Act and the Massachusetts versus EPA decision give the executive branch much scope for unilateral greenhouse gas regulation, independently of what Congress does. And yet the fifth lesson is this scope is potentially limited by the federal courts, as seen by the fate of the Clean Power Plan. So that was the Obama administration. Then, after Trump was unexpectedly elected president in 2016, it attempted a complete reversal of Obama's policies, and it largely succeeded. Internationally, it suspended participation in the Paris Agreement, It also weakened or blocked greenhouse gas regulation in all the areas where Obama had instituted them. In motor vehicles, the Trump administration weakened the last round of fuel economy increases. It revoked California's authority to set its own vehicle standards and electric vehicle mandates. That's something that went into litigation. In terms of power plants, it blocked the Clean Power Plan for existing power plants. We replaced it in 2019 with something called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which is extremely weak. It's not expected to lead to any greenhouse gas reductions because it just directs states to try to improve their energy efficiency in their power plants. And in the area of methane, the regulations of the Obama administration were blocked or delayed. They also undermined energy efficiency standards by not updating them or by rolling them back for some products. They missed deadlines for at least 21 revised standards. They also rolled back standards for some products that are high profile, like incandescent light bulbs, shower heads, and washer dryers. And finally, the Trump administration recalculated the social cost of carbon for the purpose of cost benefit analyses that many federal agencies need to conduct. The Obama administration had a price of around $45 per ton. That's the cost of the environmental damage per ton of carbon caused by those emissions. Trump administration reduced that from $45 to $7 per ton. So there are also some lessons from the Trump administration. The first of these is that Republicans are still strongly wedded to the fossil fuel industry and hostile to climate policy. And the second lesson is that whatever a Democratic president can do through executive action can be undone through executive action by a Republican president. So now we come to the Biden administration. There is a window of opportunity, I believe now, for climate policy, but its size and duration are uncertain. A window of opportunity depends on two elements: how much people care about the problem and how much political commitment there is for addressing it in a way that reduces greenhouse gases. So the concern is very high, but the issue has to compete with the pandemic and economic recovery for a place on the political agenda and for limited resources. Political commitment is high among Democrats, and it's rising among business people. And Democrats right now have unified control of the presidency and Congress, but their majorities in Congress are tiny, and they face a potentially hostile Supreme Court. So these things mean that we do have a window of opportunity in the current environment, but its size and duration are uncertain. So I want to say more about the political commitment next, I guess. It's clear that the Biden administration is very committed to climate policy. It's been a major priority during the campaign and during the first months of the administration. It's clear that they will creatively and vigorously try to adopt, implement, and institutionalize a relatively ambitious policy, one that's much more ambitious than the status quo and somewhat more ambitious than Obama's policy. But their efforts will be constrained by Congress and by the courts, which I'll describe a bit later. So in terms of the priority that they place on climate change, Biden issued detailed plans during the campaign. His top officials include experienced, strong climate policy advocates in key positions. He helped to negotiate climate policy measures in the December 2020 pandemic relief bill that Trump reluctantly signed. He took a large number of actions through executive orders on his first day in office and 1 week later. The infrastructure bill, also known as the American Jobs Plan, that he announced in late March, includes many climate policy measures. Together with his executive orders, they include the vast majority of the items that were in his campaign plans. So I want to talk about his climate policies at this point. And these policies, well, first of all, I would say some things about some general features of it and then be a little bit more specific. So there are four overall features to his policy. The first is that there are ambitious goals for greenhouse gas reduction through clean energy and energy efficiency policies. There's an overarching goal of net zero emissions by the year 2050 with legislation to enforce that. There's also now an interim goal that was announced in April at the Climate Summit, a 50% cut in emissions by 2030 compared to the year 2005. And there's also a target for the electricity sector, which is carbon-free by 2035. So on this slide here, I've updated what you saw before to include Biden's emissions targets. They're in blue and in light green. And as you can see by the angle of the decline that Biden is calling for, this is more ambitious than the Obama administration targets, which had a somewhat more shallow slope than the Biden administration targets do. And these targets are in line with his specific climate policies that he's been proposing. An analysis by Climate Analytics, for example, estimated that the quantifiable parts of Biden's climate plans would result in about a 46% reduction by 2030, mostly in the power sector. So I have a little bit of information about that here from that study. Here you can see this is emissions, what emissions would look like in 2030 under current policies. And this is what they would look like in 2030 if the Biden administration, the second blue bar, big blue bar here, the Biden administration's policies were adopted, the ones that were in his campaign plans. So most of the reduction is due to the clean power aspects, with much smaller amounts due to other things. It's still not enough to bring the US in line with achieving a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature, but it's goes a good distance toward that goal. So the policies in that sense are realistic. They're ambitious, but it's realistic that they could try to achieve those that target of about a 50% cut by 2030. Oops, sorry, I accidentally knocked out my my slides there. Let me get back here. Oops. Here we go. So I actually wanted to go back to the overview here. The second main feature of the policy, first one is it's ambitious. Second is that it's premised on green growth. It's not aiming to pit the economy against the environment, but rather it's trying to find ways for a transition to clean energy that will create jobs and spur economic growth. Third main feature is that there are also synergy seen with other Democratic Party priorities. Workers and disadvantaged communities are especially to benefit from Biden's climate policies. So just to step back a little bit from this, if you're really interested in global warming, you tend to focus on climate policy and how it affects greenhouse gas emissions and global temperature and climate change. But climate change mitigation policies, those that reduce emissions, also have major co-benefits in other areas. Reducing air pollution that's harmful to human health, supporting jobs and economic development, and increasing energy independence. So those are the main co-benefits of the policies, although there are also others. So the Biden administration focuses on two areas of co-benefit, how it can help workers in terms of job creation and how it can help disadvantaged communities in terms of pollution reduction. So that's the third main feature. And the fourth main feature is what they call the whole of government approach, that all major agencies and departments are to be involved in implementing the policy. So I also want to point out two major shortcomings of Biden's policy. The first is there are no sectoral targets other than for electricity. So we don't know where these cuts are really supposed to come from beyond electricity, how much from motor vehicles, how much from trucks, for example, how much from methane emissions, how much from agriculture. And the second shortcoming is that the enforcement mechanism for the overall targets is vaguely stated. It sounds like a carbon price, but it's not really, they don't come out and say they want a carbon price, cap and trade system or a carbon tax. And actually there are three shortcomings. The third one is that much of the plan would depend on congressional action, which is very uncertain. So those are overall features. I now want to talk about some specifics in different areas. And at this point, Biden has a mixture of climate plans, executive orders, and congressional proposals. So I just want to give you some highlights. In the electricity area, Biden has called for an energy efficiency and clean electricity standard for utilities and grid operators. which was included in his proposal for the infrastructure bill. And in Congress, there are Representative Pallone from New Jersey has a proposal which calls for an 80% cut in emissions by electricity sector by the year 2030, with partial credits for fossil fuel plants, according to Pallone's proposal. Other important parts of the electricity sector policies include extending energy efficiency and renewable energy tax incentives, some of which was included in the December 2020 bill that was passed by Congress and signed by Trump, but was mostly negotiated by Biden and the parties in Congress. This included tax credit extensions for wind and solar, as well as for carbon capture and storage, of several years worth of extensions, and a new 5-year tax credit for offshore wind, and also credits for waste energy plants and biomass. In March, the infrastructure bill includes a much more ambitious extension of clean energy generation and storage tax credits for 10 years, and also $100 billion for electricity grid investments and a new grid deployment authority. The Biden administration is also committed to expanding offshore wind. In late March, there was an announcement about a new wind energy area between New Jersey and Long Island and a target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by the year 2030, with federal support for permitting and port infrastructure and loans. Just last week, the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management approved the Vineyard Wind Project off of Massachusetts with 0.8 gigawatts. That's considered to be the project that's going to send a signal to industry to invest, that they finally have approval for a major project offshore. Biden, secondly, in terms of transportation infrastructure, the infrastructure bill includes $450 billion in spending on roads, bridges, ports, transit, and waterways. All investments are supposed to reduce greenhouse gases, as well as climate resilience, although there are no details on how to ensure that. There's also proposals for mass transit. The campaign plan was to provide for it in all cities with more than 100,000 population by 2030. In the American Jobs Plan, there's nothing on that, but there is $85 billion to modernize existing transit systems. In terms of railroads, the campaign plan called for speeding up the Northeast Corridor, extending it to the south. The infrastructure bill calls for $80 billion for Amtrak for repairing and modernizing its track. Okay, there's also important measures in the building sector. The American Jobs Plan calls for over $200 billion to produce and retrofit 2 million homes and commercial buildings, $100 billion to upgrade and build new school buildings, $10 billion for modernizing federal buildings. All of this would be saving a lot of energy and therefore reducing emissions. In the campaign plan, there's a call for a zero net energy emission standard for new commercial buildings by 2030. But so far, nothing from the administration on that. They also want to improve appliance and equipment standards, and an executive order has already ordered the Department of Energy to review 13 Trump administration rollbacks of standards. And they'll have a lot of work to do in this area because about 50 new standards are needed to comply with existing federal law. The Biden administration has also been active in vehicles. They are likely to adopt ambitious fuel economy standards. The executive orders called for the EPA to review the Trump administration standards. They started negotiating with car makers. New rules are due by the end of July. In terms of electric vehicles, the American Jobs Plan includes $174 billion, including restoring the full electric vehicle tax credit, including for GM and Tesla, which are now excluded. $46 billion for electric vehicles, charging ports. They want 500,000 charging outlets by 2030 through grants and incentives for state and local government and for the private sector. They want a path to 100% electric buses. They want to replace 50,000 diesel transit vehicles, including 20% of school buses. And they also want federal purchasing of clean vehicles to help to jumpstart the electric vehicle market, including the Postal Service. And they're supposed to be developing a plan for procurement by federal agencies now. They also want to invest in clean energy research and development spending. The December 2020 bill included $35 billion over the next 5 years for R&D on renewable energy, energy storage, grid modernization, advanced nuclear power, and carbon capture and storage. The renewable energy part is a 35% increase over the previous fiscal year. In the infrastructure bill, there's over $150 billion of research spending over an 8-year period for the NSF, for innovation, for national labs, for clean energy, $35 billion for clean energy. And they want to launch a new ARPA climate agency to oversee that research. The main areas are battery storage, advanced nuclear, refrigerants, buildings, hydrogen fuel cells, CCS, floating offshore wind, biofuels, and electric vehicles. And finally, they also want to pursue financial regulation to reduce emissions. They want to require public companies to disclose climate risks and emissions in their supply chains. So new rules are expected from the Securities and Exchange Commission on this. This could help to steer investors' decisions. The SEC has already started to request public input on the issue. They did that a couple months ago. The Federal Reserve is also becoming active in this area. Another part of Biden's plans are to curb fossil fuels through methane regulations for the oil and gas industry. The executive order has ordered a review of those. The Senate has already overturned the Trump administration's methane rules. The House is expected to do the same. That was possible because those methane rules were adopted at the very end of the Trump administration. 3 Republican senators voted for overturning those methane rules. Biden also wants to end fossil fuel subsidies. The American Jobs Plan calls for eliminating tax preferences for fossil fuels. He wants no leasing on federal lands, including in the Arctic, and the executive order called for ordered a pause on new leases. And also to aid the transition away from fossil fuels, he wants to plug old oil and gas wells and reclaim coal mines, creating jobs doing so. There's $16 billion for that in the American Jobs Plan. And there's also supposed to be investments in coal and power plant communities with a new interagency working group to coordinate that. The area of nuclear power is different from these other areas. It's less clear what the direction is. They're kind of lukewarm on nuclear power. The campaign documents called for identifying its future by looking at the cost, safety, and waste disposal issues. But nuclear power would be included in a clean energy standard, and it is already included in research and development spending. And finally, the Biden plans have a lot to say about international climate policy. The US is back in the Paris Agreement as of late February. They announced a new nationally determined contribution, a target in April. That's part of the Paris Agreement process, 50% cut by 2030. Biden says the US should also take a leading role in pressing other countries for more reductions. So they held a climate summit in April, online live stream for 2 days with 40 world leaders that represent over 80% of global emissions. There is a $1.2 billion contribution to the International Green Climate Fund included in Biden's fiscal year 2022 budget proposal, and about the same amount of money for other climate initiatives in that budget for the State Department to implement. Also notably, Biden is open to potentially using import taxes as leverage. They're called carbon adjustment fees to try to get leverage on other countries, in particular China. The U.S. Trade Representative in March said that the Biden administration is considering them. The European Union plans to adopt a carbon adjustment fee in June this year to go into effect 2 years from now. The US wants to discuss this now with the EU under Biden. So if we step back from departments and economic sectors, there are also a couple other major foci of Biden's plans. One is environmental justice. 40% of clean energy and infrastructure spending is supposed to benefit disadvantaged communities. This is in the American Jobs Plan. It's also in one of the executive orders. They also want to adopt an environmental justice screening tool based on new data to guide the decisions of federal agencies. There's an order to produce this now within 6 months, including interactive maps those agencies can use. They've also created a new division on environmental justice within the Justice Department, and a working group to report to the White House. There's more environmental enforcement for disadvantaged communities that's foreseen by the Justice Department, and the infrastructure bill includes more than $100 billion for safe drinking water. So those are environmental justice features. There's also features for labor. Campaign plan documents say they want local, diverse, and union labor, or at least well-paid labor. This is also included in the executive orders and in the American Jobs Plan, where labor standards are mentioned very frequently. They're claiming they can create 19 million jobs through the infrastructure bill. It's also notable what's not in Biden's plans. There's no ban on fracking or on new pipelines, although Biden did block the Keystone XL project by executive order. There's no 100% renewable energy target. Rather, nuclear and carbon capture and storage are part of the proposed solution. There's no carbon tax or emissions trading system. The campaign plans called for an enforcement mechanism that sounds like a carbon price. Polluters would pay, the whole economy would bear the costs, but they haven't come out in favor specifically of a mechanism. Okay, so those are the plans. The Biden administration is pursuing two main strategies to implement these plans. First, they're doing many things through executive action without congressional approval needed. The whole of government approach is a very important part of this, to embed climate policy in all the major departments. So in line with that approach, Biden's key nominees support a strong push for climate policy. Michael Regan as EPA head, Gina McCarthy as the domestic climate czar, John Kerry as the international climate czar or envoy, Jennifer Granholm as the energy secretary, Deborah Haaland as interior secretary, Pete Buttigieg as the transportation secretary, Brenda Mallory as the chief of the Council on Environmental Quality. So an initial task for these agency heads is to undo Trump's rollback of the Obama era regulations. And much of this has already been done through executive orders. So methane, fuel economy, appliance and building energy efficiency, coal power plant rules will all be reviewed. So I should say that the rollback hasn't been done, but the initiation of the rollback has been done through executive order. They've revoked Trump's executive order to promote fossil fuel development. The administration is intervening in ongoing litigation that is provoked by the Trump administration's policies. For example, they got a court to issue a stay on the lawsuit about California's waiver for vehicle emissions. Other actors have also been giving Biden help in this area. The car makers have already dropped their suit against the California emission standards. A federal appeals court blocked Trump's replacement for the Clean Power Plan a week after Biden took office. So undoing the rollback is an executive action, doesn't require Congress. Third, creating new policymaking structures. So this is part of the whole of government approach. There's a special envoy for international climate policy now. There's a new White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy. There's a Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, an interagency working group on coal and power plant communities, and another group on the social cost of greenhouse gases, which has already issued the interim values for those social costs, which range from $51 to $76 per ton of CO2. So a little bit higher than the Obama administration. Biden has also ordered a national intelligence estimate about the national security implications of climate change. And they've created a number of interagency councils on environmental justice. So there are many new organizations to implement the whole of government approach. The next thing that they can do is to issue new regulations. So executive orders can be issued quickly in many areas, but to be durable, regulations need to go through a years-long rulemaking process. So they're going to be trying to do new ambitious rules on vehicles, methane, appliances, and infrastructure. In terms of energy, they're helping with offshore wind permitting, helping the industry there. The financial sector, I've mentioned, the SEC, the Federal Reserve, are active in beginning that process. In terms of purchasing by the federal government, there's an executive order that says the Office of Management and Budget and other agencies need to create a procurement plan Basically, they want to buy a lot of electric vehicles to help the car industry to make that transition. The administration is also able to repurpose existing money, such as transportation grants and loans. The Department of Energy has $40 billion in clean energy loans left over from the Obama administration because the money wasn't lent during the Trump administration. And of course, most of the foreign policy measures that Biden's planning can be done without congressional approval. So those are all executive actions, but there are also policies that require congressional approval, especially the infrastructure bill at this point. So there's some strategies that Biden administration is pursuing and likely to pursue with Congress. One is to try to include things in larger bills, like in the economic stimulus bill in December of 2020. Now, the new infrastructure bill, that's a really huge bill that's not mostly about climate policy, but includes a lot of climate policy measures. Later on, they can also do this in annual budgets, like they are for the fiscal year 2022 budget, has about $14 billion in additional climate-related spending compared to the previous year. So that's one strategy, to include things in larger bills to try to make a broader coalition of support. Another strategy is to include carbon capture and storage and nuclear in measures where possible in order to try to win over moderates in the Democratic Party or maybe even some Republicans. And a third strategy is to perhaps use the reconciliation procedure in the Senate, which would require, means they wouldn't need to have any Republican support. They may use this for the infrastructure bill or try to. They may try to do it for the clean energy standard too. It's difficult, but it is possible. It does require keeping all 50 Democrats together in the Senate, and it requires getting items past the Senate parliamentarian as being eligible for reconciliation. So Congress is going to resist. They'll resist in some areas more than others. There's bipartisan support that's clearly possible for some things like building codes reform or investing in clean energy research. There's also bipartisan support possible, but more uncertain for other things like the infrastructure bill, electricity grid modernization, tax incentives for clean energy adoption, the clean energy standard, if it includes nuclear and coal with carbon capture and storage, then maybe they can get some bipartisan support there. But in other areas, strong Republican resistance can be expected, and even conservative Democrats might resist mandatory targets, an enforcement mechanism like a carbon price, ending fossil fuel subsidies in the tax code. So those things are a lot less likely, I think. So there are also constraints on the Biden administration's plans. The first is that there's a very crowded issue agenda. The pandemic and economic recovery have taken priority for its attention and the use of its political capital. There are major problems remaining in these areas: overcoming vaccine resistance, dealing with COVID hotspots that emerged later, managing a rapid economic recovery without too much inflation. So other issues may continue to take priority over climate policy. The infrastructure bill was presented a couple of months ago, $2.3 trillion. It has a high place on the congressional agenda. It's eligible for reconciliation in the Senate because it's all about spending and taxing, but the outcome is very uncertain. There are differences within the Democratic Party about how to finance it. So far, there doesn't seem to be any Republican support for spending on this scale. And in terms of the agenda over the next 1 year or 4 years, other issues are also likely to come up, of course: another immigration crisis at the border to Mexico, maybe inflation, maybe more BLM protests, foreign policy crises involving Russia or China or Iran or the Middle East. And moreover, whenever we think about the agenda, we need to realize that climate change is never a top issue for voters. This slide shows data from Pew in April of 2021, just last month. And Pew asked about 15 different issues, and they asked people whether they thought it was a very big problem or a moderately big problem or a small problem or not a problem at all. And if you look at those thinking that something was a very big problem, climate change is way down here. It's problem number 10 out of 15 problems. So the top problems are affordability of healthcare, federal budget deficit, violent crime, illegal immigration. Climate change is way down here. So that's not unusual. It's not just because of our current situation. This is almost always the case It's always the case. Every time I've seen data that ranks issues, climate change is low down the list. And this leaves an open question. I mean, will climate change be enough of a priority for elites so that the low priority that the public puts on the issue doesn't matter that much, doesn't hold it back? So I think that recent shifts by business may be decisive in answering that question. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But for now, I wanted to go back to the slide on constraints. Second, the constraint is concerns about the budget deficit. This has already arisen about spending and tax incentives, especially given the recent increase in inflation. It's been so much of an issue for Joe Manchin, a senator from West Virginia, that in the infrastructure bill, there's no deficit spending plan. So he wants to make sure it's all funded with tax increases, but those tax increases are then potentially unpopular with certain constituencies. This is also going to be an issue in annual budgets going forward. Third constraint, of course, is congressional Republicans, given partisan polarization and the filibuster rules for the minority party in the Senate. Environmental issues are highly polarized in Congress. You can see here, this is data on environmental voting, but it's the same for climate change, really, that we're ever since 1980 or 1990, we have had a sharply increasing divide between the two parties. We're almost at the maximum size of difference between the parties at this point. So climate change is also one of the most polarized issues for voters. This is again from the Pew data from April of 21. This time climate change is the fourth issue from the top because they're ranked by the gap between the Democrats' view of it and the Republicans' view of it. So this is voters, not officials, but climate change is the fourth most polarized issue. 61% of Democrats think it's a very big problem. Only 14% of Republicans do so. So big major party polarization, which means that probably reconciliation is the only way that they could try to get that infrastructure bill passed. The fourth constraint is conservative Democrats in Congress. Given that they have the narrowest possible majority in the Senate, 51 to 50, the most conservative Democratic senators are going to be limiting the Biden administration about everything, including major climate legislation, spending bills, and any attempt to abolish the filibuster. Manchin has insisted on no deficit spending, as I mentioned, at this point, and he wants a smaller corporate tax increase than Biden wanted to fund the infrastructure bill. And finally, the fifth constraint is that federal courts will limit Biden's regulatory efforts. Conservative judges are hostile toward administrative power, such as that exercised by the EPA, especially now that there's a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about the fate of greenhouse gas regulations. And what happens with them depends on how ambitious the new standards are, how carefully they're crafted, and how much business opposition develops to them. This probably will lead the EPA to develop rules more slowly and to prevent them from adopting standards that are so strict that business will sue, or that large portions of business will sue. So there are important constraints, but there are also some potential drivers, some factors that might promote climate change policy during the next 4 years. And in particular, recently, much of business has continued to shift toward promoting or accepting climate policy. It's important to realize that business has several possible motives for this. Some businesses prefer one national regulatory standard instead of diverse state regulations, like vehicles or clean electricity or appliance standards or building codes. Some businesses may want to shape policy rather than have it imposed on them. Or they may already need to meet standards in other countries, especially in the European Union, and therefore would gain an advantage on competitors if the US adopted strict standards themselves. Or they may want a large US market for climate-friendly products that they are developing and that they might use as a springboard into export markets. Or they might merely want to have a green reputation in order to attract workers and consumers. So in many areas, we can see that businesses have been shifting toward climate policy in the last 10, 15 years. On HFCs, the manufacturers wanted the HFC phase down that was passed by Congress in December last year, 85% reduction in HFCs over a 15-year period. They saw it as inevitable because of regulation by the European Union. They were afraid of 100% reduction rather than an 85% reduction. Electricity, many utilities support a clean electricity standard, especially if it includes nuclear and hydroelectric. Why? Well, many of them already comply with state clean electricity standards. That's one main reason. Another is that the costs of wind and solar have fallen dramatically, so that now new renewable energy plants are competitive with new natural gas plants, and they're cheaper than new coal and nuclear plants. This chart shows the cost of those technologies from 2009 to 2017. And what the line to follow here is solar. That's the dark blue one here, which this is utility scale solar, which went from being vastly expensive to now being one of the cheapest, along with wind. Here's wind. It used to be the second most expensive, and now it's the least expensive. Nuclear is the most expensive, and coal and natural gas are in between. So this is, I want to emphasize, this is for new plants, and these are the costs without any subsidies. So this doesn't affect existing plants, but it means that if a utility is considering building a new plant, they're going to be considering these three down here, and especially wind and solar, very much competitive with natural gas. Okay, so to go back to the previous slide here, in other areas too, businesses are interested in climate policy. On natural gas, Exxon and Shell and BP actually opposed the Trump administration's rollback of methane regulations. The American Petroleum Institute, their leading trade association, now wants methane regulation. They want to argue that natural gas is a clean fuel. They don't like the reputation of resisting regulation in this area. In terms of the oil industry, Exxon and Chevron now want a carbon price. The Exxon, partly because it's promoting a huge CCS project on the Texas Gulf Coast, costing $100 billion. In the banking sector, 11 trade associations recently created a climate finance working group with a list of principles in February of this year, including financial disclosure and policies to promote low carbon innovation and a carbon price. In the car industry, Tesla has grown and GM is moving sharply toward electric vehicles. Trump had actually split the car industry with his reduction in fuel economy standards. But now the car companies that side with Trump have dropped their support for the Trump administration's approach. And the industry as a whole is negotiating with the Biden administration. Okay, so business is moving. I'll be briefer now about the remainder. Another positive sign is there's been a slight depolarization on the issue in Congress. There are signs of this, but so far they haven't been really bearing any fruit during the first months of the Biden administration. Another potential driver is climate events. If wildfires, hurricanes, or drought will bring more attention on the issue and may help to create a window of opportunity. International events may also do so. Glasgow, in November of this year in Glasgow, Scotland, there'll be the next meeting of the UNFCCC. China and the EU may make increased commitments at some point. That would put some pressure on the US too. So in conclusion, the Biden administration has relatively ambitious climate policy plans. It has a commitment to trying to get them adopted. The plans suffer from vagueness about the enforcement mechanism, and they depend a lot on congressional action. Biden, however, can accomplish a great deal through executive action, although this will be constrained by the courts. Business and public opinion have been shifting to observe, due to observe climate developments and international developments, and this may help to depolarize the issue in Congress and may help to make the courts more amenable. This may make farther-reaching climate policies, such as binding targets, possible in future years. Okay. Thank you for listening. I'll be happy to take your comments and questions now.